This video is an interpretation of the Garden of Earthy Delights by Hieronymus Bosch, dealing with the prevailing written opinion about this artist, and hoping to offer an original opinion, though decidedly non-authoritative, of my own. And as we can see from some of the treatment in various documentaries about him, there is a lot of mystery shrouding him and very little is known about him.
Details of Bosch's life are extremely scarce. Virtually nothing about him is known for sure. Suspect he was born in Hertogenbosch around the year 1450, and it is likely he remained here all his life. We also know that he married a wealthy woman around 1480, and that he was a member of a local religious order, the Brotherhood of Our Lady. His death in 1516 completes his historical record, but beyond these few scanty details, the life of Hieronymus Bosch is almost a total mystery.
First of all looked for areas of agreement among the commentators and historians of art. To begin with, there are details of Bosch's paintings which are recognizably in the Flemish or Dutch tradition. The Virgin and Child in Bosch's Adoration of the Magi is stylistically related to Roger van der Weyden's St. Luke painting the Virgin. The second thing that everyone agrees about is that Bosch's painting says, "It silently speaks." Beyond those two areas of agreement, there's nothing but argument and controversy. Nearly every commentator is convinced that he has the clue to the mysteries of Hieronymus Bosch.
While it is true that there is no universal agreement regarding an interpretation of the entire piece, there is, however, certainly a plurality of agreement in a general sense that the sensuous activities depicted in the center panel are to be taken as a whole to be negative, and that the entire piece operates as a warning against lust.
The ultimately bleak message of the triptych can be readily understood. The sinfulness of the central panel leads directly to the hell of the panel on the right.
That is to say that the activities in the center panel that we see here lead directly to the punishments and damnation of the hell panel that we see here. When we type Hieronymus Bosch into Amazon, interestingly, the first three results are all books by Stefan Fischer. This is the same book in three shapes and sizes. This is the prevailing wisdom. Stefan Fischer writes, for example, that the acrobatic riders galloping endlessly around this pool are fools of Venus, blinded and whipped up by their desire for love. Fischer goes on to write that the center panel with its grotesque body language and unreal living conditions could not have been considered an ideal or positive place. Tolnay is yet another expert, and he seeks to explain this vignette here. This is the Tower of Adulteresses, whose orange-yellow walls gleam with crystalline reflections, the deceived husband's dream amidst horns. The glass sphere, that's in the upper right there, in which a couple are caressing, and the glass bell that unites a sin-filled trio, illustrate the Dutch proverb, happiness and glass, how soon they pass. The Hieronymus Bosch experts toe the prude line pretty consistently.
Those figures there, are they making love or copulating? Why 3? 2 might be respectable, 3's an orgy.
Continuing with the prude interpretation, let's talk more about Tolnay. He writes, "The cherries, strawberries, raspberries, and grapes that are offered to the human figures in which they devour with enjoyment are nothing but the godless symbols of sexual pleasure. The apple boat that serves the lovers as a refuge is reminiscent of the female breast. The birds symbolize lewdness and ignominy. The sea fish, lust or anxiety. The shell is the symbol of the female. The artist's purpose," writes Tolnay, "is above all to show the evil consequences of sensual pleasure and to stress its ephemeral character. Paul Vandenbroeck agrees that the whole painting is, quote, a warning against the consequences of sexual perversion, unquote. And in Larry Silver's modestly priced $100 book, he states that even to the modern eye, licentiousness cannot be equated with innocence.
Emerging from the actual victims paint a real picture of Harvey Weinstein, specifically a Hieronymus Bosch picture. Oh look, casual Friday at the Weinstein Company.
So I guess Silver's right. Even in 2017, Bosch is used in connection with deviant sexual behavior, using a picture in the background that's not even by Bosch, by the way, but done by one of his followers decades after his death. What about these structures towards the back of the center panel? Well, according to Tolnay, that is the pond of lust you see. The fountain of adultery rises out of it, and those other four structures are the four castles of vanity. Stefan Fischer, whose book dominates an Amazon search and whose book can be found in any Barnes & Nobles if you would like to go and look for something about Hieronymus Bosch, he writes, thematically, the central panel is based on the notion of humankind before the flood. The history of humankind before the flood, this is continuing with Stefan Fischer, condensed into just a few obscure verses in the book of Genesis, was substantially embellished in the writings of medieval authors. These texts all agree that the first age of man, which lasted from Adam to the flood and Noah, was ruled by lust.
It is Bosch's judgment. He is denouncing the world for the depravity of its behavior. The whole picture is a catalogue of sins.
As with many of Bosch's works, this is an image heavy with symbolism. Again, much of the hidden meaning may be lost on the modern viewer, but it is not difficult to realize that the artist is dealing, once again, with the business of sin, specifically the sin of lust.
Now, of course, let's not forget that there is a hell panel on the right side of this triptych. And of course, let's not forget what had been said in one of these documentaries earlier.
The ultimately bleak message of the triptych can be readily understood. The sinfulness of the central panel leads directly to the hell of the panel on the right.
And let's hear from our other dweeby friend as to what these instruments in the hell panel might mean.
Counterpoint. The fashionable, over-elaborate church music of Bosch's day, which was beginning to replace the simple human voice of plainsong. For them, it led to sin, the work of the devil. I knew I'd seen this in one of Bosch's paintings. If I was right, this fantastic musical section in the hell panel of the Garden of Earthy Delights is Bosch telling us that polyphonic music in church is a sin and a heresy, and that those who perpetrate it and enjoy it will suffer in hell forever.
Are we stuck with accepting these arguments? That's kind of what I'm wondering. All these experts think that Hieronymus Bosch was this huge prude in keeping with the times, and that he painted this triptych that is about 7 feet tall. It is a massive painting. There's a shocking coloration to it when you look at it. And all of this he poured over for the sole purpose of warning us against lust. Are there any other arguments at our disposal, or are we stuck with this? That's a pool of lust that we're looking at, and a fountain of adultery. Or are there other arguments to make? Let's start by trying to refute this guy whose small, medium, and large book come up on an Amazon search before anybody else's opinion about this artist, and deal with his thesis that the center panel portrays mankind before the flood in a state of sin, and see what, if anything, there is in the center panel that supports that. Let's start by listing some of the things we might be looking for in a flood-themed work of art. First of all, a flood. There is no flood. Secondly, a storm or rain. There is not a cloud in the sky. How about an ark? There's no ark. Genesis makes reference to giants at this time. There are no giants. If this is supposedly part of mankind's biblical history, there should be signs of worldliness, currency, industry, craft, and greed. And yet there is not one vignette in the entire center panel that carries with it an indication of that dreaded iniquity known as materialism, nor are there any acts of physical violence. Surely, lust alone does not justify an Armageddon. The lack of any man-made objects makes Fischer's argument almost impossible for a number of reasons. First, the eating of the forbidden fruit was not simply the story of original sin. It is also the Christian version of the Promethean gift of fire. It is the source not only of sin, but of ingenuity. The first thing Adam and Eve did upon eating the fruit was, for the first time, to alter their natural surroundings and gird themselves with figs, as it says here in Genesis 3:7. In Genesis 3:21, it says that the Lord God made garments of skins for the man and for the woman and clothed them. Secondly, the Bible tells us that after the fall, man-made objects came into existence. In Genesis 4:22, it says, Zillah bore Tubal-Cain, who made all kinds of bronze and iron tools. These lines are not in some obscure part of the Bible. That's from page 4. Also, the fact that there are no man-made items has a literal, practical problem for the Fischer flood idea. How is Noah supposed to build an ark? Where's an ark going to come from in this panel? These people live off of fruit. They haven't even gotten to the point where they have agricultural produce, let alone shipbuilding. It is also significant that there is no fire in the center panel. While the invention of fire is not mentioned in Genesis, it must be associated closely with worldliness and progress. Out of earth, air, fire, and water, the preponderant element is decidedly earth. If this is truly humankind before the flood, wouldn't Bosch at least have given us some kind of ocean view in the background? Something besides this puddle in the foreground to give the element of water a more looming presence. All we can see is rolling hills. It seems that they could hardly have been safer from flooding. Yet another issue for the pre-flood idea is that without any signs of civilization, how could a viewer get some sense that these people have been warned? Where's the warning? Israelites err, they're warned, they get God's word, they're warned, they stray, and they're punished. That's the cycle of the Old Testament. There's no indication that these people could have been warned. Fischer strangely includes this painting, which is indeed humankind before the flood, painted decades after Bosch's death. This contrast demonstrates everything that is missing in the Garden of Earthly Delights. In this painting, there is an ark, there is an ocean, there is a rainstorm, there are man-made objects in the jugs, table, tray, and musical instruments. There is evidence of a hierarchical government in the rudimentary crowns worn by the couple at the table. The beasts of burden in the background suggests agriculture-based sustenance. They have clothes. They're not naked and eating fruit. It seems to me that the center panel must be one of two things. It is either a parallel universe in which mankind has not been expelled from Eden, or it is a current universe that exists either as a fantasy or something obtainable in some way, whether as a state of mind or perhaps even physically. In short, Stefan Fischer's idea is actually the one thing it couldn't be. So let's hear from this prig one last time before we segue into some of the heretical writers.
One theory, the most popular, is that he was a member of a secret sect which practiced forbidden rites and orgies, and that he painted these practices.
Now, he's talking about Wilhelm Fraenger. And maybe at the time that this guy recorded this, Fraenger's thesis was the most popular, as he says. But now, as we can see, if we look on Amazon, he can only be bought used, and in fact, there only seem to be so many copies of his book for sale, unlike Fischer, whose book can be bought new in all shapes and sizes. Yet this writer, Wilhelm Fraenger, seems to hover over the buffoonish prudes like Silver, who in his $100 book complains that Fraenger remains stubbornly in print. And I must say that the moment I see language like that, I certainly get a sense of which side not to take. Stefan Fischer cannot help but refer to Fraenger in his concluding paragraph regarding the center panel of the Garden of Earthy Delights. Stefan Fischer writes, "There is thus nothing to support the claim, regularly put forward ever since Fraenger, that Bosch's contemporaries would have understood the center panel with its grotesque body language and unreal living conditions as an ideal, positive, or exemplary place." All right, let's start with some of the points that Fraenger makes before I venture off with my own. First, I love the way Fraenger deals with all of these types of writers. Of course, Silver and Fischer came after him, but Tolnay and Baldas and many others came before him, and this is how he deals with it. Fraenger writes, "Exegesis of this work has maintained the dubious distinction of being unanimous in its misconceptions, transforming a work unique in the history of art and religion into a petrified monument to prejudice." Then he continues to make some points that feel like they should have been obvious, and he asks us the question, when an unprejudiced viewer opens the panel, what do we see? So let's ask this and move on to some of the things he says. If the center panel represents sin, and the hell panel represents the punishment of that sin, certainly there is no logical transition between the lust and the natural setting and the torments of the worldly hell setting on the right, as Fraenger points out, that the hell panel shows musicians, gamblers, robbers of churches, legacy hunting nuns, dissolute priests, and brutal knights being tortured, but not a single voluptuary. He also points out that in the center panel there are none of those grim, ugly facial expressions that Bosch is capable of placing on sinners in his other works. When Bosch considers something to be evil, he doesn't let it thrive. Also, when Bosch thinks something is evil, he is very capable of being unambiguous about it. Fraenger is joined by other writers like Kerner and Lucinda Dixon in noticing that the Haywain shows us just how linear, literal, and blunt Bosch can be when he really is judging sinners. Hay, in this painting, Hay, representing money, is carted directly towards the hell panel. In this more sanctioning picture, lust is not at all central, and indeed it is almost nowhere to be found. Fraenger also points out that for someone who thinks music leads to sin, it is odd that Bosch should leave behind sheet music and that he should have painted the harp with such care. So that's enough of Fraenger. Now it is time to assess this painting from my own standpoint. Beginning with an application of common sense. If you're going to portray something negatively, why would you give it symmetry? How can a person look at this central fountain and see something grotesque? I personally see a harmonious center. The person who draws these frolicking figures and these pink and blue structures is unlikely to think with the vocabulary of Tolnay. Towers of adultery, pools of lust, castles of vanity. I think this painting is meant to become more positive from the outside looking, moving in, that is, from the right and left towards the center. Also, I think that the center panel is meant to become more positive from the bottom up, from the lower portion to the upper portion. I don't think Bosch is a prude. I think he's arguing a little bit for moderation, but he is not a prude. He's not against sex, and he's also not naive to the pitfalls of promiscuity, and he's capable of treating these pitfalls a little comically. The vignette at the bottom in my opinion, is representative of premature ejaculation. The man has spilled his seed. He hangs his head in shame accordingly. And the girl looks at us with a bit of pride to have been, in the language of Voltaire, the sufficient reason for the said explosion, the cause and effect, and looks tantalizingly at us, as if to ask if we could have done better. The foreground in its entirety, I think, can be separated into overlapping parts. Notice there seem to be two stacked triangles. There's a triangle protruding in from the left that is higher than a triangle that similarly protrudes in from the right side of the triptych. Purity and soulful intellect, while not the ideal solely for them in and of themselves, are preferable to the libertinism of the right side of the triptych. On this triangle stemming in from the right, we find pasty white figures in some form of instruction or trial and error in the world of sex. They seem to be on a knoll that is separate from the swampy pool to the left. Their white flesh shows them as newcomers, in contrast with the tan figures in the middle ground. This vignette floating on the bubble here, for me, makes all those prude arguers impossibly wrong. In the privacy of this sphere, entitled to a presumption of matrimony, I can find nothing inherently wrong with this picture, and neither Silver nor Fischer attempt to explain it. I think, though I'm not sure, that these birds and these grayish people coming in from the left are people who are too heady, too thinking, too prude, and are not ideal. They are reluctant to engage in sexual activities. The oversized birds, I think, are signals that they overemphasize intellectual pursuits. One of them even has something like an alchemical beaker on his head, indicating that his mind is not on worldly things. So the left, to me, is where we find purer intellectualism. The right, we see the world and the body. Consider these lines from Goethe's Faust. Two souls, alas, dwell in my breast. Each seeks to rule without the other. The one, with robust love's desires, clings to the world with all its might. The other fiercely rises from the dust to reach sublime ancestral regions. And that's the end of that quote. Goethe, of course, took this concept of the inner and outer man of the two souls from Erasmus, who was a contemporary of Bosch. Now let's think about this as we look at the middle ground. On the right, we see a structure of libertinism and skankery, an overemphasis on the body, a non-procreative emphasis on the body. It is the only one of the five structures that sits entirely on the middle ground. On the left side, we see the intellectual structure. This is purity and the mind. This structure has one part in the earth of the middle ground and one in the procreative waters. Streaming out of the entrance to this structure are men riding animals, which is to say that they have mastered their animal instincts. These riders represent a triumph of mind over body, but also a kind of harmony between the two. The birds resting on their heads represent the role that the mind has played. In the right side building, the men are still half monkeys, unevolved, and still part animal themselves. Revolving around the pool, we see that on the edges of the circle of riders, there are the negatives of the left and right. On either side, we see vignettes of entities that are less than willing to join the circle. On the right, we see a body without a head. Protruding from it are black and blue asses to indicate their non-procreative urges. They are all about the body. On the left, we see a head with no body. This negatively portrays the brain and mind with no bodily urges, and of course it is the head of the bird. As I had said before, I think the birds may well represent someone who's too flighty, too heady. We see resistance from participation in the circle coming from heads that are angled into the ground. We see a matrimonial coupling in the middle, within the privacy of a fruit, where husband and wife are taking the correct attitude and properly fornicating, as is perfectly acceptable. The fact, however, that these left and right vignettes are attempting to join suggests that Bosch does not damn them on the spot. They can make progress. They are not disinvited. They are still allowed to arrive. Indeed, there are openings waiting for them. The women in the pool are both positive and negative, I think. Some of them tempt the men. Others wait patiently. But I do not think that we should view this orbit that is, the riders riding around this fountain of youth, as gravitational, as in it's woman-centric and the men are drawn to it lustfully. I believe it is depicting actually the concept of centrifuge. And here, I have to admit, I'm taking a bit of an alchemical, esoteric, unlikelier stance here. Centrifuge is an alchemical process by which objects that are more dense and substantive are thrust out from the middle of a chemical situation. It is still used in chemistry today. You see this concept at work at theme parks where you get inside a cylinder and it spins and you stick to the wall. That is the concept of centrifuge. The heavy object clings to the wall. And notice how similarly here, the men swing. They move around, they revolve. And these men, I think, who have mastered their animal instincts, therefore, thrive at a safe distance away from temptation, have the courage to resist it, and that it is actually the alchemical concept of centrifuge that is working here. Alchemical symbolism is being used to prove the harmony of the men. Also, notice the balance of the men and the women. The women in the middle, those are also the right women with the right state of mind and the harmonious state of mind. Notice how there's a balance. The harmonious men cling to the edge, and the chaste, good women stick to the middle, so that there's this harmonizing balance between man and woman. At the top of the painting, of course, we have perfection. In this fountain object, we have a unity of phallus and womb, of sun and moon, of sunlight and water. You know, one of the reasons that the Egyptians erected obelisks, and the reason that they're shaped, you know, they get narrower the higher they go, is because they're supposed to be sunbeams. That is the sun germinating the earth. Similarly, here we have the kind of womb-like vessel receiving a phallic-like germination. This central fountain is a picture of sexual unity. To show the lunar components, Bosch has incorporated various crescents. He has also has scorpion stingers skewering eggs, as if we weren't certain that this is devoted to procreation. Now, in the blackness of the whole, I think we are not invited. We could get a glimpse into it, but I don't think we are invited. In my opinion, we do see the beginnings of something like a heretical theme from Bosch here. We have a rectum that is being offered, indicating sodomy, and we also have a third guy who is behind the wife, indicating that they have a kind of an inclusive marital situation going on in there. But I think Bosch wants us not to condemn this, that in the privacy of a marriage and within the bounds of consent and matrimony, everything is fair game.